They say the mountains remember. And in the silent heft of that truth, I found my reason for returning. For a decade, I had been an absent landlord, leaving this valley my valley to the stewardship of silence and the elements. A career had pulled me east, a relentless gravity of concrete, neon, and conference calls that had swallowed 10 years of my life whole. But the pull of this place, it was a different kind of gravity, one rooted in history and soil, one I could no longer ignore. I was done with the noise. The final leg of the journey was always the most significant. The paved road gave way to the gravel track, and the gravel track dissolved into the two ancient ruts leading down into the floor of the valley. The air changed the moment my tires crossed the invisible boundary. It became sharper, cleaner, tasting of pine, cold stone, and permanence. This wasn't just a relocation, it was a reintegration. My family settled this land before Homeowners Association was a term, before development was a blight, before the subdivision of Stone Creek Estates even existed as a hopeful line on a developer's blueprint. This cabin, rustic but solid, isn't a weekend getaway. It's the heart of the original land grant, a legacy bound by ancient deeds and the testimony of granite markers. I came home not merely to occupy a house, but to reclaim a piece of history. As I stepped out of the truck, the silence was immediate and profound. It wasn't empty silence. It was a breathing, expectant quiet, heavy with the weight of years. I inhaled deeply. The city's dust was already falling away. I stood there for a long time, just listening to the wind move through the cedar and the distant rush of the creek, confirming that everything was exactly as I had left it, exactly as it should be. The decade of absence was compressed into a single, sharp moment of recognition. This is where I belong. The small cluster of modern houses perched precariously on the ridge, the ones that formed the aforementioned Stone Creek Estates, were barely visible from this depth. They looked like nervous tenants clinging to the fringe of a great and indifferent kingdom. I knew they were there, a necessary inconvenience of the modern world. I had received their official paperwork over the years: bylaws, fee schedules, newsletters about community barbecues, all filed efficiently into a box labeled irrelevant. I had ignored them because, quite simply, they were irrelevant to me and to my land. I walked toward the cabin door, the familiar weight of the old, brass key in my hand a comforting counterpoint to the enormity of the mountains surrounding me. The key was heavy, worn smooth by generations of hands. It wasn't just opening a lock, it was unlocking a decade of suspended life. I inserted the key, turned the mechanism, and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams slicing through the window panes, shimmering like tiny ghosts of the past. It was silent, preserved, and utterly mine. I had returned expecting peace, the quiet I had earned. I returned expecting solitude. I had not, in any scenario, factored in a confrontation. I had returned to the mountains to escape complexity, not to face a bureaucratic audit. The mountains remembered me. Yes, but they were new. Human inhabitants on the edge of the valley who seemed determined to forget the fundamental rule of this territory. The land has an owner, and that owner is now home. I was ready for solitude. I was not ready for the petition that was waiting, laminated and aggressive, right outside my gate. I had spent 3 days in quiet reintegration, the silence of the valley washing away the grit of the city. I was chopping firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe against the block of meditation, when the sound arrived, a jarring, mechanical screech that echoed betrayal in the ancient woods. It wasn't the natural cry of the mountains. It was the shrill intrusion of misplaced civilization. The woman, whom I would later know only as the self-appointed president of the Stone Creek Estates Homeowners Association, exited her vehicle with a purpose that felt disproportionate to the task. She didn't approach, she invaded, and her weapon was bureaucracy. The notice of violation wasn't just a piece of paper, it was an act of architectural and botanical auditing. The sheer audacity was stunning. The document listed, in bullet point misery, every perceived sin committed by a cabin that had stood on this ground for over 80 years. Unapproved structure, referring to the structure that predated their entire subdivision. Non-conforming paint palette, applied to the deeply weathered, natural wood finish that the cabin had worn since the 1940s, but the violation that truly twisted the knife was excessive unmanaged foliage, aimed directly at the ancient, magnificent cedar tree that shaded my porch and had sheltered generations of wildlife. They were auditing a forest. This was their declaration of war against the wilderness itself, an attempt to impose manicured conformity on untamed granite and timber. I let her staple her decree. I watched her from the shadows of my porch, leaning on the axe handle, a calm observer of a species I thought I had long since abandoned, the rule maker. I recognized the type immediately. They are individuals for whom power is not an earned right or a responsibility, but a title purchased with an oversized home and a desperate need for control. She had clearly rehearsed this moment, her clipboard held like a shield, her posture rigid with self-importance. She had come to witness compliance, or, failing that, to initiate the process of financial harassment. But she had come to the wrong valley. She had mistakenly approached the center of gravity, believing it to be merely a satellite. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans, allowing my presence to register. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Her efficient, bureaucratic gait stuttered. When she spoke, the tone was a forced blend of professional grievance and barely contained personal offense. She didn't ask a question. She issued an indictment. Every word was clipped, every phrase laden with HOA-approved jargon. She was a torrent of prefabricated suburban complaint, convinced her laminated rules superseded the very bedrock upon which I stood. She didn't see history. She saw code violations. She didn't see a legacy. She saw poor curb appeal. My silence, I believe, was what truly maddened her. I let her talk, this furious little engine of grievance, her voice echoing absurdly in the profound, indifferent quiet of the mountain. I wanted to hear the full extent of the fantasy she had constructed, the fantasy where she was the magistrate of my land. She cited Section 4B, Section 9C, and a bewildering addendum about exterior lighting color conformity. It was a performance I wouldn't interrupt. I had to let her exhaust her inventory of grievances before I dropped the anchor of reality. My internal thought, dry and certain, was simply this: this is going to be entertaining. But the lesson, for her, will be permanent. I waited for the final, breathy pause of her verbal assault before I moved. She finally ran out of codes. There was a satisfying little intake of breath, the sound of a battery running dry, and in that vacuum, I took my step. She was demanding architectural review forms, threatening daily fines, and insisting that the deadfall, a natural collection of nutrient-rich timber, was a fire hazard she was entitled to remove. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't refuted a single point of her exhaustive, ridiculous catalogue of complaints. That level of engagement would have granted her legitimacy, and she deserved none. My response was not verbal. It was physical, a slow walk towards the very edge of the claimed violation, to the fence line she believed was the boundary of my property. I let her watch me approach the oldest marker in the valley, a piece of original granite, placed by the first owner of this land, nearly a century ago. It was weathered, partially hidden by creeping mountain grass, and utterly immovable. The look on her face suggested she thought I was submitting, perhaps going to retrieve the required forms. She mistook composure for surrender. The moment she fully believed she had won was the moment I began the dismantling of her entire reality. She was utterly convinced that the few acres surrounding my cabin were Lot 17 of Stone Creek Estates, subject to her governance. She saw the mountain as a backdrop to her cul-de-sac. She didn't realize she was living on the mountain's periphery, and I was at its heart. She had built her jurisdiction on a faulty premise, a modern subdivision superimposed carelessly onto an ancient land grant. The truth, the immutable, recorded truth, was about to be presented. My focus was not on her clipboard, but on the land itself. The weight of ownership in a valley like this is profound. It's not about paying a mortgage. It's about being the steward of everything from the subterranean aquifer to the highest pine on the ridgeline. She saw a poorly maintained yard. I saw a legally defined kingdom, and the queen of the neighborhood association was about to find out she was merely a tenant, standing in the wrong spot. I turned back to her, my expression firm, devoid of anger, yet possessing a severity that only absolute, unchallenged legal authority can confer. I remember the light catching the worn brass of the old key in my pocket. I knew the deed was secured inside the cabin, waiting for its grand unveiling, but I needed to establish the line first. I didn't need the paperwork yet. I needed the visual proof of her mistake. I knelt, brushing away the grass from the granite marker, revealing the faint, hand-chiseled initials that denoted the beginning of my true boundary. This marker was the pivot point. It was the moment the bureaucratic fantasy was due to crash into granite reality. Her reign over my time and my property was measured in seconds. The confrontation was over before she even realized the true scale of the war she had started. She had demanded compliance, but she was about to receive a legal lecture on the meaning of undisputed title. I had endured her tirade without interruption, a calculated patience. To argue her bylaws, to defend the patina of age on my cabin or the wild perfection of my forest, would have been to grant her premise a legitimacy it utterly lacked. My response would not be a debate, but an execution, a swift, surgical severing of her fabricated authority from the immutable reality of the land. I presented the deed of title. It was not a flimsy printout, not a sterile copy. This was the original parchment, a substantial scroll that crackled with the dignity of age and unchallenged legal truth. As I unrolled it on the granite slab, the sound was dry, ancient, and utterly definitive, the whisper of history asserting itself against the clamor of modern bureaucracy. Her eyes, which had been darting with the agitated energy of a petty magistrate, now widened, struggling to comprehend the vastness of what lay before them. The document wasn't merely a piece of paper. It was a physical manifestation of absolute ownership. The deed didn't describe Lot 17 or Parcel A, it delineated the entirety of the valley floor, a sweeping expanse of land bordered by the crests of the surrounding mountain ridges, from the meandering path of the ancient creek to the distant outcropping known only as Sentinel's Peak. It spoke in the language of metes and bounds, a precise, almost poetic cartography of the natural world, beginning at the old cedar, thence following the line of the spring to the great stone, thence north by northwest to the watershed divide. Single quotes. This was the description of a kingdom, not a subdivision plot. It laid bare the truth that the Stone Creek Estate's development was not a part of my land, but merely a small, modern enclosure built around it. The color began to drain from her face, slowly at first, then rapidly, like a tide receding. Her initial aggression gave way to confusion, then to a sickening disbelief. The intricate web of codes and covenants she had so confidently woven, the entire tapestry of her HOA authority, unraveled before her eyes. She had arrived expecting to chastise a wayward homeowner. She was suddenly faced with the undisputed steward of the territory. The shift in power was not gradual. It was immediate and total, a paradigm shift that left her utterly disoriented. Her posture, which had been rigid with self-importance, softened, becoming brittle and suddenly vulnerable. Her clipboard, moments ago a weapon, seemed to droop uselessly in her grasp, a prop in a play whose script had just been violently rewritten. I allowed the heavy silence to stretch, letting the immense gravity of the parchment settle, pressing down on her illusions. This was no negotiation, no petty argument over yard waste. This was a unilateral declaration of sovereign land ownership, a truth etched into the very fabric of the county records. She had spent 10 minutes cataloging my violations, her voice shrill with perceived authority, oblivious to the fact that her meticulously constructed world of fines and conformity was utterly irrelevant to the man standing before her, the man who, by right of this very deed, controlled the valley floor, the life-giving creek, and, indeed, much of the very access that serviced her own fragile community. The look in her eyes confirmed it. She understood, in a flash of cold, stark clarity, that she had not merely picked a fight. She had challenged a monument. The metallic clang of her clipboard hitting the granite was sharp, a single, definitive sound that marked the end of her delusional reign. Her jaw hung slightly open, her mouth working uselessly, attempting to construct a final protest, a defiant retort, or even just a simple, undignified insult. But no words came. The legal reality, unassailable and indisputable, was a physical barrier she could neither breach nor circumvent. She couldn't conjure a bylaw potent enough to override a patent deed signed decades before her subdivision was even conceived. The stark truth was that her association's power began and ended with their neatly manicured, asphalt-lined cul-de-sac. Their authority applied only to their own carefully bounded lots. My land, by profound contrast, encompassed the essential utility easements, the very wellheads that supplied water to the entire valley, and, perhaps most gallingly for her, a significant portion of the shared access road leading to their isolated community. The entire Stone Creek Estates development wasn't designed to encompass me. It was built around me, an awkward, modern ring trying to encircle an ancient, independent core. They had made a fatal assumption that money and modern zoning automatically superseded deeply rooted history. They had assumed I was merely a temporary inconvenience, a relic to be quietly absorbed or pushed aside. They were profoundly mistaken. I watched her retreat. It was not a dignified withdrawal. It was a clumsy, almost panicked scramble. She stumbled backward, her head swiveling erratically, as if trying to grasp the sheer, terrifying scope of the valley that was now defined, irrefutably, as my domain. She was desperately trying to measure the distance from her minuscule jurisdiction to my vast, sovereign territory. The defeat was comprehensive, absolute, and delivered without me needing to raise my voice or waste a single breath on argument. I had simply laid bare the facts, as recorded in the history of the county, for all to see. The shrill squeal of her tires, spitting gravel as she sped away, was the final, dissonant punctuation mark on a rain that had lasted perhaps 10 minutes too long, a pathetic protest against an unyielding truth. The mountain, the silent, patient entity that had borne witness to generations of human folly and aspiration, was quiet once more. The sense of victory was not one of triumph over an adversary, but rather the quiet, profound satisfaction of the restoration of natural order. I had returned home seeking peace, and by decisively defining my boundary against her aggressive intrusion, I had, with one ancient document, established the absolute, unchallengeable terms of that peace. The lesson was delivered, indelible. Some ownership is absolute, and some boundaries, particularly those carved by history and nature, are not to be trifled with. The valley was mine, and I, its silent steward, was finally home, its quiet king. The sound of her retreating tires, spitting gravel as she fled, was the final, pathetic crescendo of the conflict. It was followed immediately by the return of the valley's true melody, the whisper of the wind through the pines, the distant rush of the creek, and the low, reassuring chirp of the high country birds. The noise was gone. The chaos of misplaced authority had vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind an even deeper sense of unbroken solitude. It wasn't about winning a fight, not in the vulgar sense of triumphing over a person. It was about defining boundaries. It was about drawing a clear, uncompromising line in the sand door. More accurately, in the ancient granite between the transient, fabricated rules of a modern subdivision and the immutable, fundamental laws of property and history. The mountains had always known who the true owner was. Now, the inhabitants of Stone Creek Estates knew it too. My victory was not one of personal satisfaction, but one of inevitable order being restored. The deed of title, that heavy parchment, now rested safely inside, a silent guardian against any future intrusion. Its existence was more than just a legal fact. It was a philosophical statement. It declared that ownership here was not a transaction or an investment opportunity. It was a stewardship. I wasn't just managing a property. I was the custodian of a living ecosystem, a tract of land that deserved respect and independence, not the imposition of aesthetic conformity and petty fines. I sat there, sipping my coffee, the warmth in the mug a pleasant counterpoint to the crisp mountain air, and considered the sheer absurdity of her demands. She had wanted to audit the cedar tree, a magnificent specimen that predated her subdivision by half a century. She had wanted to prescribe the color of a cabin that stood on the valley floor when her own home was just a hopeful sketch on a developer's pad. Her vision was small, defined by the edge of her own lot. My vision, my reality encompassed everything the eye could see and much that it couldn't. The aquifer beneath, the watershed that fed the entire area, the very slopes that gave the valley its character. The profound difference was one of scale. Her association was built on the premise of mutual constraint and control. My land was built on the premise of absolute independence. The knowledge that I controlled the primary access easement, the fact that their development was reliant on the very land they sought to police, was the quiet leverage that would ensure permanent peace. There would be no more notices, no more demands for architectural review. The precedent was set, sealed, and delivered by the ancient, unassailable language of the law. The quiet I had sought for a decade was not just returned, it was fortified, guarded by the undeniable truth of the deed. The land was settled, and so, finally, was I. The work of reclamation was complete. The silence that followed the confrontation was the truest form of victory. It was heavy, not with tension, but with resolution. It spoke of systems returning to equilibrium. The mountains, which had allowed the brief, shrill intrusion of human folly, had now reasserted their own, deeper authority. I had merely served as the instrument of that reassertion. My primary task now shifted from conflict to stewardship. The challenge wasn't in fighting the HOA. It was in honoring the commitment inherent in the deed. This land was now my sanctuary, my responsibility, and my legacy to protect from any future, equally absurd encroachments. The HOA's lesson was learned. They now understood the legal reality of their circumscribed existence, forever clinging to the periphery of a greater, private whole. Their attempts to levy fines or impose standards had dissolved into nothingness, leaving them with the awkward reality of having to coexist alongside a property they could neither control nor influence. I spent the remaining light securing the cabin, not against intruders, but against the weight of time. Every creak of the floorboards, every draft under a window, was a dialogue with the past. The work was simple, physical, and profoundly satisfying, a stark contrast to the sterile, intellectual combat of my former life. This was true work, measured in tangible results and grounded in the unchanging environment of the valley. The experience with the HOA served as a potent, if unwanted, reminder that vigilance is the cost of independence. The world of codes and covenants, the realm of those who seek to impose artificial order, always waiting at the gate, ready to mistake silence for weakness and tradition for negligence. But they now knew the core truth. My silence had been strategic, and my tradition was backed by the oldest law in the county. I returned inside as the last light failed, leaving the valley floor to the moonlight and the wind. The final image in my mind was the expression on her face, the moment of complete, staggering comprehension that she was small, and my land was immense. That defeat was not just a rejection of her authority. It was a total collapse of her self-importance. I came home for solitude. I stayed, not just to live, but to be the quiet king of the valley, the keeper of the deed, and the silent enforcer of the true, unassailable boundaries. The mountains remember, and now, definitively, so will they. My peace was secured, purchased with the quiet authority of an undisputed, ancient title. The story of the valley's true owner had been told, and the curtain had finally and permanently fallen.